Even among Sri Aurobindo's works, and of course all of Sri Aurobindo's works are mind-boggling in their scope, in their quantity and their quality both. Even amongst them, Savitri occupies a place of pride which is unique by itself. The original legend of Savitri occurs in Mahabharata as a minor episode and occupies just about 700 lines. What Sri Aurobindo has done is to keep the basic storyline intact and expanded it to a poem about 24,000 lines long. And further, this is a poem which keeps the storyline intact but is quite different in its scope. What Sri Aurobindo has done is to weave into this mystic poetry running into this stupendous length of 24,000 lines the human aspiration for an escape from this world of evil, suffering, misery and death, but an escape not into some other world, not into heaven, but on earth itself. That is it possible to get rid of these imperfections of human life, of worldly life, and bring heaven itself down on earth? Let's first look at the legend of Savitri as it occurs in Mahabharata. The legend starts with a king Ashwapati, a noble king who was happy and contented in every respect except that he didn't have a child. And to get this child, he performs austerities for 18 years. The austerities consist of a yajna every day in honor of the goddess Savitri. And at the end of these 18 years of austerities, the goddess is pleased and asks him to ask for a boon. And when he asks for a child, the boon is granted, and she tells him that a beautiful and virtuous daughter will be born to you. True enough, the daughter is born, and since she is the result of the boon granted by the goddess Savitri, he names her Savitri. Savitri grows up to be a beautiful girl, and she is as beautiful as she is flawless in character. But as she grows up and starts approaching the marriageable age, Ashwapati finds that there is no one who really comes to ask for her hand in marriage. And this often happens with such people because Savitri was perfection personified, both in terms of her physical beauty and her character. And such people are very easy to admire from a distance, but very difficult to live with. And therefore, therefore an ordinary person, and most of us are ordinary, are quite intimidated by such a person. Now in the Indian tradition, a father feels that it is his duty to give away his daughter in marriage, and therefore Ashwapati started feeling that he had failed in that duty, and therefore one day he asks Savitri to go and find a mate for herself. She sets out on this quest to find a mate for herself, goes to the forest and meets there a prince Satyavan. He is a prince, but his father, who was the king of the Shalva kingdom, Dyumatsena, his father is an exiled king and therefore lives in the forest in a hermitage, and Satyavan is there in the forest to chop some wood. That's what he does every day for a living, and Savitri meets him there, and she is captivated, and so is he, and they decide to get married. Now Savitri comes back home, and when she reaches home, she finds that in her father's court there is also the sage Narad. Now Narad is a sage who is a sort of a hotline between heaven and earth, keeps shuttling between earth and heaven, carrying the messages from God to earth and back from earth to God, and he is there. And when they ask her about the outcome of her mission, she tells them that she has found Satyavan in the forest and has decided to marry him. Narad seems to know everything, and he says that Satyavan is handsome, noble, truthful, but yet Savitri has made a mistake. So when Ashwapati presses him to come out with the truth, he says that Satyavan is destined to die exactly after a year. Then Ashwapati tries quite hard to persuade Savitri to go and find someone else, but she says these are things which are decided just once, and now that I have made up my mind, I shall not choose again. Narad reassures the king that let Savitri's choice be honored, and in the end, everything may turn out to be all right. So with that assurance, the king agrees, and Savitri and Satyavan get married. Savitri turns out to be a very good wife and a devoted daughter-in-law. And since this is something which she has all the time weighing on her mind, that Satyavan is going to be around only for a year, she is not very happy, but at the same time she doesn't want to share her agony with anybody else, because she feels that if they do not know about it, let them stay happy in their ignorance. When there are just 4 days left for that fateful day to arrive, she undertakes a practice called Triratra. Now this is a practice, a traditional practice involving 3 days and nights of non-stop fasting, praying and standing. And this she does in order to accumulate those spiritual powers which will help her somehow save Satyavan. So at the end of these 3 days comes the day on which Satyavan was destined to die, and that day she seeks the permission from Satyavan's parents to accompany Satyavan to the forest. So she goes with him, and Satyavan goes to the usual routine, but while he is chopping wood, he starts feeling uneasy, then he gets a severe headache and tells Savitri about it. Savitri knew what is happening, and she tells him to lie down, puts his head in her lap, and within a few minutes Satyavan appears dead, and in front of them Savitri can see is the god of death, Yama. Now Yama starts walking away with the Satyavan's soul, and Savitri follows him. Something unprecedented, something which nobody has ever done. So Yama turns back and tells her to go back and take care of the funeral rites of Satyavan and not to follow him into forbidden territory. But Savitri insists that as a devoted wife, it is her duty to follow her husband wherever he goes. And then she tells him about the dharma of a righteous wife and many other things, and finding that it's not easy to convince Savitri to go back, and being impressed with her virtuosity, he starts granting her one boon after another to persuade her to go back. And in those boons, he grants wishes like, Satyavan's father, Jumatsana, getting back his eyesight and getting back his kingdom, and Ashwapati getting 100 sons and so on. But Savitri still continues to follow Yama, and to cut a long story short, finally the god of death, Yama, does concede defeat and returns the soul of Satyavan to Savitri. And she comes back with it. The soul re-enters the body, which is still there on earth, and although they are late in returning from the forest, Satyavan and Savitri walk back to the hermitage, and we are very pleased to see that not only now the king has his eyesight, but then soon after that his kingdom is also restored, and it ends as a happy story. And the usual interpretation of this story is that it symbolizes the great power of a dedicated and committed wife. So it's a sort of a story that glorifies womanhood, and particularly the great strength that a woman can accumulate by being a loving, dedicated and fully committed wife. Now in the Mahabharata, the legend of Savitri is a minor episode occupying exactly 300 shlokas or about 700 lines. While keeping the storyline intact, Sri Aurobindo has expanded it to 24,000 lines. To understand why he needed that type of expansion and why he chose this legend as the framework for weaving a story of great cosmic significance, let's look at the characters one by one. Now, Sri Aurobindo's Ashwapati is also a king, a noble and pious king, but he is not worried about being childless. His quest is for a greater life for mankind. He is concerned why the earth has so much of evil, suffering and misery. Is mankind always destined to suffer this while on earth? And why it is not possible for man, being a manifestation of the divine, to realize the divine itself here on earth and make the earth heaven-like instead of aspiring to a heaven in some other world. So it is with this quest that he undertakes his yoga, and this yoga goes on for years, and after reaching the personal salvation, which is the goal of all traditional yogas, Ashwapati is not satisfied, and he continues because his yoga is not just for personal salvation. In fact, it is more for liberating mankind from the yoke of imperfection. And finally, the Divine Mother appears and tries to convince him that he should be satisfied with his own spiritual accomplishment, his own realization, and should not try to change earth. Let earth be as it is destined to be, and heaven will be heaven and earth will be earth, and he need not try to bring heaven down on earth. But Ashwapati is not satisfied, and his persistence pays, and finally he is granted a boon that he shall be blessed with a daughter who will accomplish what Ashwapati wants. Then Savitri is born, and she grows up into a beautiful and virtuous girl. Nobody approaches her for marriage, as in the legend of Mahabharata, and her father sends her to look for a mate for herself, and she finds that mate in a forest in Satyavan. And the story moves on. But then when she returns home and finds Narad in the court, now here again Sri Aurobindo has used this opportunity to bring out a profound debate between the usual practical or pragmatic approach of reconciling to the imperfections on earth and a highly unrealistic looking optimism which expresses the hope and in fact a certitude that it is possible for things to change, and that the human aspiration can be a part of the divine design and heaven itself can descend on earth. And this debate takes place between Narad and Savitri's mother, because when Savitri talks about her having decided to marry Satyavan, Narad knew everything about Satyavan, and so did Ashwapati, possibly because of his great spiritual capacity. But then here Sri Aurobindo brings in Savitri's mother as the ordinary human being and a very concerned and loving mother who does not want her daughter to get married to such a person. And in fact, she gives all the arguments, in fact very plausible and realistic looking arguments about why her daughter should not get married. And not only that, in fact she talks about many of the sort of philosophical aspects of why human being is destined to suffer, and in that if there is a divine, then possibly he is not he does not have the type of powers and does not have the type of love and compassion which one expects from the divine. Otherwise he would not let such things happen, and otherwise if God was as powerful and as loving as we assume him to be, the fate of human beings would not be so cruel. So she comes up with all those arguments. You know, the human faith gets a little shaken when you find that you are in this miserable state, and one feels that one does not deserve it. So that's the type of attitude that Savitri's mother takes. And Narad tries to show her the other side of why pain and suffering is in fact necessary on earth, and further tries to convince her that she should let Savitri have her way, because she should not try to interfere with the divine design, and she should let things happen the way they are destined to be. So Narad, who is a bridge between heaven and earth, in fact once again has a great symbolic role here, because that is exactly what Sri Aurobindo's aspiration, or Ashwapati's aspiration, is. His aspiration is to bring heaven down on earth, and there could be no other agency better than a bridge that already exists in Indian mythology in the form of the sage Narad, to bring that message to Savitri's mother, and in a way give also some profound wisdom to Savitri. Now Savitri was a divine figure. The divine itself descended on earth to accomplish a certain mission. But for the sake of outer form, even those who have not needed a guru have adopted a guru to set the right example for humanity. And in a way, Narad takes on that role of a guru to Savitri, and gives her that wisdom. And since she did not need too much of it, just this brief encounter is enough, and after that Savitri can be left on her own to accomplish her mission. Something like, the way Vasishtha comes in for a short period as Rama's guru. So here Narad steps in during this brief episode to play all these roles, and he is just the right character to play that role, because here the mission is to transform earth into a heavenly version, and there can be no other symbol better than Narad, because he symbolizes anyway the bridge between heaven and earth. So then Savitri gets married, and here instead of waiting for waiting when there are till just 4 days are left before Satyavan is destined to die, she starts her yoga straight away. And this yoga again is not a traditional yoga. In this yoga she goes through the overmental, that is the extremely high level of spiritual realization at which the person can see the oneness of all creation and oneness of the one that is beyond all creation, but yet the perception of division and multiplicity and plurality and differentiation does not really completely disappear. In spite of this awareness of the oneness, the division continues to persist. But from there, she goes into that zone which lies between the overmental and the supramental. That is what has been described as the golden lid in the Upanishads. That is that golden and glamorous lid. Glamorous and golden because in the overmental itself, the person is in such a state of bliss that probably he does not have much of an incentive, much of a temptation, or even he does not even entertain the possibility that any realization beyond this exists. And therefore it's a golden lid, hiranmayena patrena. So she breaks through this golden lid and reaches that zone between the overmental and the supramental, signifying that even the journey from the overmental to the supramental is itself a long journey. And that intermediate zone is the nirvana. The nirvana where she experiences an emptiness, a void, the negative absolute. And after staying there for some time, she further moves on to the next stage of realization, the supramental. And having realized that, now she is fully equipped to accomplish the mission for which she was sent to earth, that is, to transform the world and worldly life into a perfect form so that it befits the divine that it manifests. So she reaches this level by the time the day on which the Satyavan was destined to die is very near, and then on that day she once again seeks the permission from Satyavan's mother to go to the forest. She accompanies Satyavan to the forest, and Satyavan dies and Yama appears, and then Savitri follows him to heaven. Now once again there is a rather long and very educative debate between Savitri and the god of death. The god of death symbolizing the present human state and its inevitability. It's the impossibility of achieving any change. In fact, the god of death is shown as one, who is doing this, taking the souls of people away, those who are dying, but at the same time he is not very happy doing it. He pities them because he realizes that all these people are finishing their life, reaching the day on which they are destined to die without really achieving much of spiritual growth. They forget the mission for which they come to earth, waste this precious opportunity, and go back more or less as they arrive. So he pities human beings, but yet he takes them away because death is a spiritual necessity, and without that certainty which we associate with death, without that human beings probably would not have even that much of an incentive to do anything towards their spiritual growth. So realizing that it is a necessity on earth, he is playing his role, pitying mankind, and yet he tries to convince Savitri that this is how things are always destined to be, and do not try to convert earth into a heaven, because that will never be. But then Savitri argues with him and tells him that is it that just because a child looks so helpless and so underdeveloped, does it mean that he'll never grow up into an adult? Just because the earth today is as it is, does it mean that it is always destined to be so? After all, the earth is a manifestation of the divine, and therefore it can grow towards the perfection that the divine itself is, and why it is not, she can't understand why it is not possible for the divine to manifest more fully, far more completely than it already does on earth. And once again, death grants Savitri several boons, but she is not satisfied, and finally the god of death concedes defeat, and Savitri returns to earth with Satyavan's soul. Now the defeat of death in this legend symbolizes the defeat of the usual point of view, the usual pessimism, which we sometimes call pragmatism, that earth is always destined to be as it is. Things just cannot change. And it symbolizes the victory of the mission that Ashwapati had of transforming life on earth. So it is with that mission that he started. He got the boon. Savitri was what he got to accomplish that mission from the divine, and Savitri has accomplished that mission. And when she comes back, she sums up in one line her realization, which in fact can be considered the Mahavakya of Savitri: to love, to feel love and oneness is to live. So that in fact sums up her philosophy, which would lead to the transformation of earth.